Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Greetings, everyone. So glad you could join us again today. We have, again, as usual, another wonderful guest who will tell us his story about the 1950s. Jackie, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hello,
Yes.
everyone, whether you're watching this morning, noon, or night. Anyway, I want to call your attention to the purple banner below. It's www.whilethewindmillwatch.com, and there you can get all sorts of information about the authors, the vendors, and the 1950s Fun Chat, which you are about to experience again. Now look in the upper corner. I don't know if it's right or left for you, but anyway, you'll see a picture of our book, While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s, and this spawned the 1950s Fun Chat. You'll also notice a little white dot there that indicates an award that the book won as the Independent Press Award for the best regional, the favorite regional book in the regional category. So on we go. We're going to talk to someone today with whom we know you will really connect with. Picture this humble scene in the late 1930s. A dirt road, a farmhouse with no running water or electricity, and our guest, Keith Whigham, coming into the world in 1938 in that farmhouse near Blanchard, Ames County in southwest Iowa. Keith joined an older sister, whereafter a sister joined them. So the family lived on a farm, a small farm, 100 acres, a diversified farm. It produced crops of corn and of alfalfa, as well as it raised hogs, milking shorthorns, and sheep. Well, fast forward the life of our guest from his birth to his education at Iowa State University, where he earned a Bachelor of Science in Agronomy, followed by a Master of Science and a PhD in Crop Physiology and Management. Keith was an international soybean agronomist for many years. So we will learn how the 1940s and the 1950s influenced him and took him to that institution of higher learning. Keith married Myrna in 1964. Their union resulted in 3 children and 6 grandchildren. Keith resides in Green Hills community in Ames, Iowa. So, Keith, we welcome you to the 1950s Fun Chat.
Very good. Thank you. I look forward to the chat.
Oh, good. Well, before we learn about the 1940s and the 1950s and how it affected your life, let's look back to the Civil War. How did that war touch your family, Keith?
My great-grandfather was living in Ohio at the time and was drafted into the Ohio infantry. And he ended up on the battlefield near Washington, D.C., was injured, shot in the leg, as I understand it, and was in a hospital for several months in Washington, D.C., and then they had a ceasefire. The war was over. He returned to Ohio, and he and his family then moved to upstate New York. They were farmers and merchants, but great-grandfather had problems with his health, and the doctors recommended he find a different environment. At that time, he had 4 children, and his wife had a brother in Blanchard, Iowa, and so they decided to move everything to Blanchard, Iowa. They came on train at that time, lived in a dugout house for a while, and eventually then bought 40 acres of land. That was in 1886, so it's a century farm now. And that's the farm that I moved to when I was 3 years of age and remained there until I went to the military. We had a great time on the farm. It was located near the town of Blanchard, which is a border town between Missouri and Iowa. In fact, the border of the state was behind the in the alley behind the main row of office stores in town.
Hmm.
I can remember I always helped Dad milk cows in the morning, and in January, you can imagine it was cold getting that 50 yards from the house to the barn where the 5 cows were that we milked. The cats were always waiting on us and meowing.
Sure.
And so it was a relief when the temperature was about 0 or below to sit down by that cow that was warm. You leaned your head and your shoulder into her.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a relief to be in a warm environment. The barn itself was all open in the lower level, but the outside doors were closed, of course, but it was a lot warmer than the outside without leaning up against the cow.
Yes.
Of course,
Amazing.
the cats really enjoyed having fresh milk to drink.
Mhm.
And we always, when they finished milking, we would give them some milk to drink, but they would meow and let us know they were hungry. So I would take the teat and squirt milk into their mouth, and they would just lick it up like it was dessert or something. So that was a reminder of what happened on the farm. That was quite interesting.
Yes, it is.
Another thing that happened on the farm, on Saturday night, the family loaded in our 1941 Mercury and went to Coyne, Iowa for shopping. It was about 5 miles from home. We took eggs to sell at the produce store, and the cash earned from the eggs then was used in the grocery store to get essentials that we weren't able to produce on the farm, like sugar, oil, and some other things like that.
Mm-hmm. How did you heat your home, Keith? Was it with coal or oil?
We had coal. Well, at early on, we had a cook stove that used wood or corn cobs in the kitchen. But we also had a coal furnace in the basement, and that provided our heat. And eventually we got rid of the stove on the main floor and had electric there, but it was all coal furnace heating.
Mm-hmm.
Go
Was
ahead.
your house a typical farmhouse of that era, kind of 1.5 stories?
Well, it was called a 4 square. It was a 2-story house with a full basement. There were 4 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs. And the lower was a large kitchen, living, dining room, and an extra bedroom and bathroom on the lower
Pretty
level.
fancy.
Yeah. It was built in 1923 and is still standing.
Uh-huh.
Although we don't own the acreage anymore, someone else lives there, but it was well built, had slate shingles, and they were still there when I left home in the 80s.
So was that one of those houses that could be obtained through the Sears and Roebuck catalog?
No, it wasn't, although some in the neighborhood was of that kind. This was, my grandfather was a carpenter of sorts and a metalsmith. And so he took pride in finding a construction man who would do the work with him and tell him what to do or not to do.
Okay. So now we've heard about your life on the farm. Can you tell us about your early education in the country school?
Yes, the country school was 1.75 miles from the house that we lived in. That's now the Century Farm. And 3/4 mile was dirt road. And then it was a state highway for the next mile, and it was gravel. So most of the time we walked. Sometimes we rode a pony, and seldom we got a ride. But it was 1.75 miles. The country school was called Mount Pleasant, and the country school included residents in 4 square miles, and it was in the middle of the 4 square miles. We had a large class. My class was 6 students, the largest in the group. And I think one teacher had 25 to 30 students total. But you sat in the classroom, the kindergartners sat in the front row, the 8th graders in the last row, and there was a blackboard all the way across the front. Above the blackboard was script writing and capital letters and so forth, A through Z, that we all had to learn early on. And one exciting thing that we always had, the teacher liked to make gifts for the parents for Christmas. So classwork essentially shut down at Thanksgiving, and it was make a project, some kind of a knickknack or a tray or something for the parents. And then after Christmas, we start back up with classroom activities. But when I was in the 6th grade, then the school was so large, the school board decided to send not only the freshmen in high school to town, but also the 7th graders and 8th graders. So I got to go to town school in the 7th grade. My sister was 2 years ahead of me, and we both moved at the same time because she was ready for a freshman in high school. Mm-hmm. But we didn't have bus service by our house until my sister and I started high school, because the county would gravel the road if it was a school bus route. And so my parents were even pleased that we finally got to town school and we were on a bus route.
Yes. How can you summarize your country school education?
Well, it was teamwork. We had to haul water in for the sink, coal in for the furnace. The older students showed the younger students how to do things and so forth. For exercise and games, we played handy over the schoolhouse. Mm-hmm. We would, in the winter, we would go sleigh riding, but we started saving one day in January and save the recesses and add them on to the noon hour so we could walk a quarter of a mile away to a slope and sleigh ride for an hour period. And everybody enjoyed that. Yeah. I'm not sure we learned anything the rest of the day when we got back, but it was enjoyable.
Well, somebody had exhibited some negotiation skills right there with the teacher.
Well, yeah, and they were worthwhile later on in life.
Yes. All right.
Did you come back with soppy wet mittens and have to put them on the stove or over the heating element?
No, we didn't put them on the stove. There wasn't a place for that, but we put them in the coat closet that was the first entry hallway in the school, and they dried somewhat, but they were still damp when we got home.
Sure.
Yes. Huh. But worth the fun. Worth the fun.
Yes, wonderful times.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, in town school, then I was in the 7th grade, enjoyed the new environment. The class size came up to about 20. And when we graduated, we still had 19 in the class. I think there were 10 girls and 9 boys. But the girls are more studious than the guys. We were more interested in sports. Uh-huh. But in the 8th grade, I was fairly athletic and participated in track and stuff in the 8th grade and waiting for high school football. And one of the high school students said, "Keith, why don't you come with us? On Saturday night, there's an amateur boxing contest in Missouri, Granite City, Missouri, about 40 miles away." And one of the upperclassmen had a driver's license. I didn't know what to expect. I said, "Sure, I'll go." There were 4 of us went. We all checked in. There was no fee to enter. And we got fitted for gloves. And we each were given 3 rounds of 3 minutes each. Ooh. And so, fortunately, I was the only one of the 4 that won their match. And I was given $3 as a prize for winning. Well, now that was a total surprise. And so we went home, and I was very happy and everything else until Monday morning.
Oh.
The teacher said, "Mr. Glenn, the superintendent, wants to see you in his office, Keith." So I didn't know what it was about. I walked in, and he said, "Whigham, if you want to participate in any high school sports in Ames High School, you have to send that $3 back, because technically you're a professional for being paid for participating in sports." Well, undoubtedly, I rushed home and mailed the $3 back. And I was never classified as a professional from then on, but it did scare me a little bit.
Interesting.
And about 3 months later, I got another letter from the AAU, which had sponsored the tournament. And in it was a short letter and $3. Oh. And the note said, "Keith, this is a gift for your younger sister."
Oh, nice.
And so I guess technically I didn't lose anything by turning back in the money, because I got back in the end.
Did you give that money to your younger sister?
No, I didn't, because she didn't know how to spend it.
The truth
She
comes
was
out.
5 years younger, 5.5 years younger than me.
Well,
Did you ever watch the Saturday night fights on TV?
Well, every night that after we got a TV, that was always boxing match and then professional wrestling. And so we didn't watch TV much during the day, but we would watch those sports at night. And I was very active. I participated in football, cross country, basketball, and track in high school. We didn't have a baseball team, but I played on a town team, softball team in the summer. But it was interesting in the band, and I was in band and chorus and went to All-State 2 years and so forth as well. But I was the biggest kid in the class in the 8th grade that could carry the tuba. So I was carrying the tuba at football games because the band had to have a full band to participate at halftime. So I'd take my helmet off at halftime, put on the tuba, and do a marching band. And that way I didn't have to listen to the coach's lecture at halftime. But later I transferred to a trumpet, and I was playing all the time then. And so I didn't have to play in the band at halftime my junior and senior years.
Boy, you had to have a lot of energy to be playing football and then to carry that tuba.
And then to blow the tuba.
You didn't worry about it. You just did it.
Yeah, that's right.
And the cross country season was short because we didn't have a cross country track. There were no golf course in town or anything else. But the coach got notified that there was a team mile run in Iowa City, which was about 3.5, 4 hours ride by car. And so after the football game Friday night, we went home up at 5 o'clock to get in a car and drive to Iowa City for a 10 o'clock track meet on the stadium at the University of Iowa. We'd never run a race that distance before or anything else. And we didn't place, but it was exciting, and I had a lot of good conversation coming and going.
Sure.
And then a month later was the state cross country meet, which was in Ames, Iowa, at Iowa State. And we participated in that again, but I ran in more hills that day than I've ever run in before. But anyway, it was a good way to get some exercise and get out of study hall late in the day because you had an excuse to go to a sporting event.
So is that how you were introduced to Iowa State?
That is how I was introduced the first time I was there. The second time I was there was later when I was in college and actually participated in a orientation for an IFYE program that I'll talk about later.
Okay. So then let's go on to your Marine Corps experience. You had been exposed to a college campus, but yet you joined the Marines. Now tell us about that.
Well, I'm in the first in my family to go to college ever. And my sister didn't go to college either. There was no encouragement about agriculture or education in the home. There were no books. There was a newspaper and some farm magazines, and there was no encouragement to go on. But the top of that off, there were no college prep courses in the high school.
Mm-hmm.
The only science course I ever had until college was a general science course in the 8th grade, taught by the superintendent, who was also the football coach. And when I can remember, he walked into the class. It was early afternoon. The students were all talking, and he'd walk in and slam his fist down on the table. That was his desk. The table would jump off the floor by an inch, and he had our attention. We had a general science class. But in coursework in high school was set for everybody except for one course, and that was either home ec or agriculture. Well, you can guess which one I took.
Mm-hmm.
But there was an exception because every spring, the boys and girls switched teachers, and we learned how to make hamburgers and I have no idea what the girls learned about agriculture. That's the way it was through all those years, and I survived. I knew what agronomy was and agriculture, but not much more than that. Had no idea what my career was going to be. I lived on a 100-acre farm. My parents were middle-aged, but not ready to turn the farm over to me. And I had the draft looking over my shoulder, as I always say, because if you weren't married or you weren't actively involved in farming or a job, the draft would take you to service in one of the branches. So I decided I had a cousin who was about 6 years older than I was, who was attended the Marine Corps and participated in the war in Korea. And he always bragged about how much fun he had and how strict they were and so forth. And I was fairly well disciplined already. And so I enlisted in the Marine Corps in the Air Wing. So I signed up for 3 years. Left on March 18th of 58. My tour of duty would have been finished in 61 in March. Went to boot camp in California, went to schooling in Florida and Tennessee. And my first station assignment was in North Carolina on Camp Lejeune at the helicopter base. And I was a structural mechanic. And so I worked on painting, repainting, renumbering, repairing cracks, whatever it was needed to be done on the body of the aircraft.
Did you have any choice? Did you have any choice in where you went or what you did when you got there?
No, but I had to extend my tour of duty to go, but I'd already seen all of North Carolina I wanted to see for about 15 months. And so I extended for 3 months in order to go to Okinawa. Yeah.
And
in Okinawa, we started the first helicopter base in Asia for the Marine Corps. It was on a fixed wing airport that was used during World War II and it hadn't been used since. So we had to construct new hangars, new sleeping quarters and everything. But it was exciting. I got to go on a special trip to Korea for 8 days because the President Eisenhower was coming to visit Korea. And we had a delegation that had to inspect the president's helicopter, which is the same model we were using. So we were there 8 days. He was there 8 hours. We inspected the helicopter and made sure it was flyable. He played golf in his 8 hours he was there. And then we flew back to Okinawa. A couple of more months later, we got notification that the USS Hornet, Navy aircraft carrier, would be coming by Okinawa and we're going to temporary duty for a couple of weeks. So don't take any dress clothes, just take work clothes. We're not going to be on shore. Well, that wasn't true. We got on the ship in August and we came back in December. In the meantime, we cruised from Okinawa to the Philippines. We're on land in the Philippines for a week, cruised to Hong Kong, anchored there for a week, cruised back and forth until we finished. But it was a good experience to see the Philippines and to see Hong Kong.
And there was an active war then, was there?
There was no active war then. At least we didn't know about one. And my term was about over, and I saw an advertisement on the wall in the operations office that to get out early to go to college, you can make an application and so forth. And here you have to choose a discipline. Well, I'd already extended for 3 months, but I was willing to get out early to go to college. And I figured as many officers as I worked with in sports, I played football, basketball, and baseball in the Marines, that if all of those officers were able to graduate from college, I surely could too. So I made up my mind I was going to major in agriculture. So then I had to pick a discipline on this list that was about 4 feet long and 4 columns, single space, starting alphabetically. So I was in a hurry that day anyway, and I started at the top of the list and agronomy was the first name I recognized in agriculture, and I've been an agronomist ever since.
It suited you well.
Yes.
So then I came home and I was able to start college in September. I was discharged to San Francisco, came home on a troop ship from Okinawa, which 2 weeks on a troop ship is not fun and games. But then I applied to Northwest Missouri State College in Maryville, Missouri. And it was about 35 miles from home. And I thought, well, I'll give it a try. I rented an apartment off campus. I didn't think I wanted to handle a dormitory life since I'd been doing that for 3.25 years. So I rented an apartment, followed the catalog of Iowa State University because that's where I wanted to graduate. And I took ag courses and math and chemistry and so forth. And in fact, our sophomore year, I was in the same class as my wife-to-be, Myrna Snegelberger. And I sat right behind her because the rows were serpentine alphabetically so the instructor could keep track of us. And I couldn't understand this young lady's last name sitting in front of me. And if I was going to ask her out on a possible date, I had to know what her name was. So I tapped her on the shoulder after the class. And she asked me what I was doing there. And I said, well, I'm transferring eventually. I need the course. And we got together and dated a few months. And then it came time for me to participate in the International Farm Youth Exchange Program. And I was selected to go to Japan. And I left in June of '63. And Myrna said she'd wait for me. And that was good news. And so I took a cruise on a ship to Japan, another 2-week cruise on a commercial cruise line. Was met by hosts in Japan. They had it set up. I was there 5 months. I stayed with 5 different families, all on the farm. One family was a dairy farmer. Another one was a general farmer that had a lot of poultry. The third one was a vegetable producer. And his goal was to have vegetables ready by 5 o'clock when the farmer's market started in town every day of the week. So we were up at 4 harvesting carrots, whatever was in season to get them ready. And then we worked with the poultry and so forth later in the day. And after 3 weeks with this family, now my host, all 3 of my hosts had lived in California for a year. So they knew a little English, but not a lot. But this one got up enough nerve to have somebody who spoke fluent English to ask me how much I was to be paid. And it was a free program. It was sponsored by Mitsubishi in Japan, and my expenses were paid and everything. And I said, "Oh, I can't take any money." And I got 1 more hour sleep from then on. The rest of the time I was there because he got his money's worth out of me. And then my last family was general farming, the rice and mung beans in central Japan. Wonderful family. And I had taken along, we were suggested to take a small gift for the family, not anything elaborate. So I took silver dollars. When I worked in a grocery store in college, I bought up silver dollars that people were paying for their groceries for, and I had a collection. So I took each one of them a silver dollar. So I got that out the last night I was there at the family. I got the silver dollar out and presented it to him. And all of a sudden, a hush come over the living room where we were sitting on the tatami mat. And Mama-san took off and was gone, and the conversation continued. There was one son that spoke some English in the family. And Mama-san came back and unwrapped this cloth wrapping she had in front of me. And there were 4 ancient Japanese coins that they gave me in exchange for the 1 silver dollar I gave them. And they dated back to the 1500s in Japan. And I treasured them, and that was probably the reason that I started collecting coins later in life.
Yes.
One other story about the IFYE experience in Japan. Number one, I had only tasted rice as rice pudding on the farm. We always had potatoes. Well, I was thrown the first 2 days I was in Japan, I was thrown out of youth camp. And what do you think we ate 3 meals a day? Boiled rice. I did everything I could to improve the flavor and the taste. I used butter, I used salt, I used pepper. But by the end of the week, I was able to eat as much rice as the Japanese students. And to this day, I enjoy eating as much rice as I do Irish potatoes. Anyway, it was a wonderful experience and one that I wouldn't give up if I even had the opportunity to. But the reason I was sent to Japan, there were several other countries available, but on the application form, they asked if we knew a language, a foreign language. And if so, are you fluent, medium language, or street language? Well, I had picked up street language living in Okinawa for 15 months. And so I was honest on the application because I wanted to go to Europe. I'd never been there. And they sent me back to Japan. But I'm not sorry. It was a totally different experience in Japan as an IFYE than it was in the military.
Sure.
So back up, how did you even get involved in IFYE? How did you begin to even know that it existed?
Well, I was very active in 4-H.
Okay.
After high school, I was a 4-H leader. I was on a 4-H judging teams at the state fair for several years during high school. And I had never heard of IFYE. But while I was in the military, the folks had a spare bedroom. And my mother was a 4-H leader, and she heard about the program. And I had a young lady from Peru, South America, come and stay with my mom and dad and little sister as an IFYE exchange student. And so she then encouraged me my second year in college to apply. And I said, well, why not? And I did, and was one of 7 from Iowa in 1963 to participate. One of the larger IFYE groups, I think. But we've had some wonderful experiences meeting annually and tried to and so forth since then.
So tell people what IFYE is, please.
IFYE is the International Farm Youth Exchange Program sponsored by 4-H. And so the National 4-H Foundation, we took our training there before we departed.
We had hosted an IFYE on our farm in 1956.
Several of them.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, the one who I remember was Olga Roth from Uruguay. She was just the sweetest young gal and knew no English, and we knew no Spanish. So it was an interesting story.
And by the way, IFYE started in 1948.
Yes.
So, and is it still going as far as you know?
It slowed down. A year ago, there were 2 or 3 students from Iowa went, although I didn't hear of any going this year. So funding is a problem.
Yeah.
And of course, now it's easier to travel internationally for a family vacation than it was back then. And there is not as many hungry youth that want to go overseas and work on the farm. And that's what most IFYE experiences are.
Right.
One other story about IFYE. My first family, the dairy farmer, had 3 children. The oldest was 12 and the other 2 were younger. She was in the 6th grade and I was 25 at the time, and she spoke more English than anybody else in the family, but it wasn't very good. She asked me to come to school with her once a week and teach the English class that she was studying. So I agreed, and I was shocked when I got to the class because the Japanese lady teaching English had learned English by studying British tapes.
Oh.
I couldn't understand her. And the students probably didn't understand me either. But I endured for the 3 weeks there, and I spent an hour. But anyway, I call this girl my Japanese sister. We went back. I visited the family 2 or 3 times later than that when I was in Japan on business. And the last time Myrna, my wife, went along, and she hosted us. She took us to the farm, which was the 3-hour train ride from Tokyo. But by that time, she had a master's degree in veterinary medicine from Tokyo University. On the way back to the airplane in Tokyo, she said, "Mr. Keith," as she referred to me, "I would always like to go to Iowa State and get a PhD. Do you think I could do that at Iowa State?" And I said, "Well, there's only one way to find out. I'll find out for you and see what will happen." We made it happen. She came and got her PhD in vet med microbiology and took a permanent job with the National Animal Disease Lab here in Ames. She went back home almost annually. She never married, and she retired in Ames and has a small acreage at the edge of Ames. She's still here.
That is so heartwarming. That's very heartwarming.
Yes.
Oh.
Well, you have much experience in international agriculture. Can you just tell us a little bit about that, please, Keith?
Yes. I transferred to Iowa State as a senior. I had worked in a grocery store while Myrna finished her BS degree in science education. And in 1965, she graduated. We moved to Ames. I started as a senior with 1 year left. She taught school at United Community Schools west of Ames. Mm-hmm. And we were having a good time. And after the year, I was looking forward to getting a job at a farm co-op. And I was stopped in the hallway one day by my major professor because my grades weren't the best. And he said, "By the way, Keith, would you be interested in being a teaching assistant next year?" Well, that wasn't in the nearest dreams of being a teaching assistant. I said, "Well, let me talk to Myrna." And we accepted the job. And so I stayed on for a master's degree and a PhD. And in the meantime, our son was born. And then Myrna enrolled for a master's degree at Iowa State in physiology and the botany department. And she graduated with her master's the same day I graduated with my PhD. And we had to find a job for me particular. Myrna was pregnant again by that time. And the best job that was on the market for me was a job with USDA in foreign agriculture, working in the country of Uganda as an agronomist, a cereal agronomist. Well, to be honest, Myrna and I were not good geographers. We had to get a map, look up to find where in the world is Uganda. Well, if you don't know, it's bordering Kenya and Congo. Kenya is on the Indian Ocean in East Central Africa. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the day after we graduated, we took off with a 3-year-old intact and a pregnant wife. Went through training in Washington, D.C. and off to Rome for some rest on Easter and saw the Pope, even though we're not Catholic, and went on to Uganda. The embassy had a car ready for us. So they checked us in and said, "They're going to take you to the research station, and they've got a homebred. They're ready for you." Well, we were exhausted from flying from Rome to Nairobi and then to Entebbe. And so we jumped in the car. We didn't have any idea. It was a dusty road part of the way. Part of the road, it was partial asphalt, but it was 250 miles to the research station.
Oh, my.
And it took most of the day because we got in the morning and we got into the research station in the evening. But we were welcomed by other team members, Americans who were working on the same project. And they were wonderful to us. They took care of us, showed us the ropes, as you can imagine, in a new country. Mm-hmm. But the good thing was the language was English because it used to be an English territory.
Okay.
Now, the hooker was that when we were hired, President Abodi was in charge of the country, and that was December of 70. We arrived in April of 71, but in January of 71, Idi Amin Dada a military general led a coup and overthrew the former president and ran him out of the country. So the new president, Idi Amin, became one of the most notorious, brutal presidents in the world, second after Hitler, as some people say.
Oh my.
And I read a book of his history later, and one of his junior officers wrote a book about it that was his understudy during his entire career from 71 to 79. He was finally run out of the country. But he estimated that at least 100,000 people had been killed, most of them Ugandans, because they had gotten in Idi Amin's way or didn't agree with him. In fact, was an Episcopal bishop, which is a regional bishop for the regional part of Africa. So he was a brutal man. I met him once, shook his hand, explained our research program in the research station about growing corn, sorghum, and millet. And after I explained the program, he says, "Why don't you grow rice?" Well, this was northeast Uganda, which was semi-arid, and it was primarily pasture land and a little corn and sorghum. Sorghum was a staple in the diet. So I turned to my Ugandan counterpart that was supposed to be following me every place, and I said, "Sam, why don't you explain why we don't grow rice?" So I lived through it anyway. Then a couple of months later, Idi Amin kicked the Israelis out of the country who were training the military and building highways and hotels. And they were told to drop everything and be gone by the weekend. Well, the Israelis didn't always do what they were told. And they developed a convoy of all the machinery that they had used in construction in the country. And they knew where all the military stations were because they had trained all the people. And they had a convoy of equipment and just drove over in Kenya, knocked the border gate down and just kept driving, and nothing else happened except Israelis were welcome in the country after that. And then our daughter was born there in July of 71. We were told that they had one of the best hospitals in East Africa. We believed them. We don't now because we toured it, and the rooms and the hallways were filthy and so forth. So we found a Catholic mission hospital with a medical doctor from the UK, delivered Leah, our daughter. Everything went well, except I was concerned because in the hospital, they had two room rates, a private room or a ward room, and the ward was 25 rooms where the African-American women usually stayed for birthing. And so we opted for the private room, and my insurance only covered semi-private. So Myrna was there about 2.5, 3 days in the room and everything taken care of. And we had 3 children, but this was the only one I got to assist with the delivery.
Okay.
Dr. Dugan said, "Keith, you grab that leg and arm, and I've got this one, et cetera, et cetera." And, but I didn't get to do that with our other 3 children. It was a special experience.
Did you always feel safe then when you were there?
When we were alone, yes, but we didn't necessarily feel safe because the military were running loose all over the country, and you never knew what to expect. Most of the military didn't speak English, even though that was a national language. They had a tribal language. And especially during the time of the takeover then in September of 72, Obote, the former president's supporters, made an attempt to retake the country. And so we were told by the AID mission to prepare for a vacation. We shipped our car to Kenya. We boxed up all of our goods and put them in storage. The embassy car picked us up and we had tickets and authorization to leave. A U.S. embassy car picked us up with U.S. flags on the front fenders. And it took us 3 hours to go 30 miles because every 4 to 5 miles we would stopped at another roadblock. Soldiers manning the station, most did not speak English. They all had rifles. Where are you going? What are you doing there? When will you be back? Why are you going? Etc. Wanted to look through our suitcases. But we went through this 4 or 5 times getting to the airport. Well, shortly before that, Idi Amin most of the business people in Uganda were of Asian descent because their ancestors came to Uganda to build the railroad back in the 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
And so they all had British citizenship because they were from Pakistan or India. And Idi Amin decided that you give up your British citizenship and only have a Ugandan citizenship or get out of the country. Well, these Asians were quite wealthy, businessmen and so forth. The stories were they left 3 Mercedes in the driveway and $1 million home and took a taxi to the airport and got the next ticket out of the country. Mm-hmm. But they had all been able to ship money out and had a bank account in some other country. Mm-hmm. But so anyway, we were on the way to the airport. We got there and there were hordes of Asians waiting to get the last seat on the plane that was leaving that day. We had seats reserved and we got the last 3 seats running across just before the plane was supposed to take off. So we were lucky to escape when we did. And we were under the assumption that we were going to be in Kenya for a couple of weeks and would be sent back. But after 10 days in Kenya, a U.S. government office told us, well, your job's over in Uganda, come back to the States, finish out your job at Iowa State to have the 2 years, which we did, and got back. And so I didn't have a job with the government anymore. And I interviewed for a job, and one that was interesting to me because it dealt with international variety of soybeans. Mm-hmm. There was not an international testing program for soybeans at that time. There's one for corn, one for rice, one for wheat. And so a grant was obtained from USAID to develop a testing program from scratch. Mm-hmm. And I was the principal investigator that did that. After 3 years, we had 367 trials in 108 countries. And we packaged up 16 varieties in replicated trials, provided instructions how to plant. We provided inoculation, so nitrogen would be fixed associated with the roots, gave them a plan on what data to collect, when to collect it, and so forth, and asked them, and these were going to research stations and universities all over the world in those 108 countries. And I and some others of our team visited nearly all of those sites sometime during those 3 years.
Oh my goodness.
Fortunately, at the end of the program, we only got about 60% of the project returned, and some had to be discarded because they hadn't done it correctly. But we did have useful information because soybeans are very sensitive to day length for flowering. And so as you got closer to the equator, of course, you had an effect on the flowering. So we sent 16 varieties, and then we left 4 open spaces for the country to add 4 local varieties to compare. When we got the data back at the end of the program, then we analyzed the data. 10 degrees from the equator, north or south, was one zone for 500 meters elevation. The same latitude for up to 1,000, 500 to 1,000, and over 1,000. And then we did the same thing from 10 to 20 degrees, and the same thing from 20 to 30 degrees. And so at the end of this, we had somewhat of a recommendation whether they should investigate U.S. beans to be imported and grown or the local varieties, something to recommend to those institutions to study. But it happened after 4 years, the program was ended because we were there to provide protein in the diets of starving people in developing countries. That was our theme. Mm-hmm. But the soybean farmers of the United States had heard about our program and boycotted USAID, that we were competing an soybean import competition for U.S. soybean farmers. So the project ended. And here I was, unemployed again, looking for a job. And it just so happened my major professor at Iowa State was changing jobs. And so his teaching and research position was open. The department chair called me up. He'd heard I was looking for a job, and he said, "Well, Keith, I think it's time for you to come home now. We know about you. We don't need a visitation or an interview. I'll give you a few days to think about it, check with Myrna, and let me know if you're interested as assistant professor." Well, it didn't take us long to say yes.
Yeah.
What we were getting into. John Pissick, the department head, was a great administrator. So I came back then to Iowa State as an assistant professor with teaching and research. No extension work at that time, but then I got involved in advising and was professor in charge of the farm operation curriculum in the 80s. We had each of us, there were 4 advisors under our master's students, and myself. We each had about 100 students one year. And in 88, there was a change of administration, and the former vice president of the university, George Christensen, had lost his position because a new president was elected, and presidents like to bring their own provost or second in command with them, which this president did. So the new president asked Dr. Thompson or Dr. Christensen, "What would you like to do?" Well, George Christensen was always interested in international work, and he had been attending some international agriculture meetings and so forth. He said, "Well, Iowa State doesn't have an international affairs office. We need to be more involved in international work, and I'd like to direct the Office of International Affairs." They said, "Sure." So then they started looking for associate directors and somebody to direct the World Food Institute, which was in the College of Agriculture. So I moved to Beardshire, was associate director of international affairs and director of the World Food Institute for less than a year. And Dr. Christensen got a job as vice president of the University of Alaska. And I was eventually promoted then to interim director of international affairs, which I performed for 4 years. And again, had opportunities to travel abroad, work with university officials abroad, recruit students to Iowa State, and so forth.
And well, then, Keith, yes. We're about the end of our fun chat. What an amazing story you shared with us from Blanchard, Iowa, to the world, to so many countries of the world, and how special that has to be for you and your memory bank, and for Myrna and your children, everyone associated with you in your life. Thank you. We're so appreciative of having you on our 1950s Fun Chat today.
Well, I've had an enjoyable career, and I would suggest it for anyone.
Okay. Do you have a fun memory of the 1950s, or an outstanding memory? A short
one from the 1950s. I had a lot of experience stories, but from the 1950s, I think maybe a surprise to me, in 1952, the spring of the year, we were sitting in the assembly hall at the high school. So the 8th grade was also up in the high school. And we were seated, the youngest in the front of the room and the seniors in the back of the room. And a local merchant, we didn't have a TV at home, but a local merchant was selling TVs. And he brought a black and white, probably 30-inch, set it up in the front of the room. And we watched the coronation of Queen Elizabeth in the auditorium of the high school. And I'd never seen TV before. We didn't have one at home until after I went to the military. And it was number one, getting introduced to what the Queen and the coronation was like and everything else, and new electronics and TVs.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for slipping that in.
Yes. Jackie, how can you close our program today?
Guests and of our viewing guests, thank you for joining us. And this is just another educational interview we've had. An interview that has been has been educating you in the modern history of the 1950s. So until next time, tell your friends, even your relatives, about the 1950s Fun Chat. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.